Vascular complications are a major issue for diabetes practice, and I'm delighted that we've got with us now Helen Colhoun, who's been chairing a session on the prediction of vascular complications in type 1 diabetes. Welcome, first of all. Tell us some of the key takeaways, and starting first perhaps with why is this such an important area?
Well, I'm delighted that there was a specific session on cardiovascular disease prediction in type 1 diabetes because it's a very, very challenging area. We know that people with type 1 diabetes continue to experience somewhere between a 2 to 3-fold, depending on age, attained age, risk of cardiovascular disease. It continues to be the major cause of death, and it is also, as we have shown previously, the major cause of loss of life expectancy in type 1 diabetes. Having said all of that, there is very wide variation among people with type 1 diabetes in their cardiovascular disease risk. Some people develop cardiovascular disease risk relatively early. Some people live long, healthy lives and never develop cardiovascular disease. So it's a real challenge to try to detect very early on in the course of type 1 diabetes who is destined to be most at risk. Now, at the present time, we do not have very good predictive algorithms for doing that. And that's actually manifest, for example, in the new lipid guidelines that came out just there at the end of August from several of the European bodies, including the EASD, whereas for the rest of the population, including type 2 and the general population, there is advice to calculate the cardiovascular disease risk as a preliminary step in deciding who to assign preventive therapies to at a given age, like, for example, what age to introduce statins at. For type 1 diabetes, because of the absence of good predictive algorithms, there is a blanket statement that from the age of 35 upwards, such therapies should be introduced. But we all know that that's going to be a very blunt instrument. And what that means is that some people at risk before that may miss having treatment, and some people who are not at risk yet for another few decades will be getting treated unnecessarily, potentially earlier. So that's by way of explaining why we need to improve our ability to predict and discriminate among people with type 1 who is more at risk and who is less at risk.
Okay, so you had several speakers today. What were their thoughts on this? How can you predict it? Are we talking about inflammatory markers, for instance?
Okay, so we've had a number of interesting, I would say, tantalizing pieces of data today that aren't, I would say, confirmatory, but are useful and interesting. So from several studies, we have measurements of circulating microRNAs.
Remind people what microRNAs are.
Okay.
Some people, it was quite a long time since you went to medical school.
So this is to do with basically gene expression, markers of gene expression. So, and then we also have markers of inflammation. So cytokines, which are circulating markers that tell us a little bit about the inflammatory process. So we have markers such as those. And we also have markers relating to the process of advanced glycation. So for example, age formation, methyl dioxyl formation, and related compounds. These are shall we say, non-enzymatic sugaring of important molecules, all right, for way of a general explanation. So, and for several of the studies, what they have done is taken people with existing vascular disease with type 1 and compared the levels of these compounds in blood to those without cardiovascular disease, and they find some interesting and in some cases quite substantial differences. Those are just a preliminary findings, though, really, because there are future steps that need to be done. First of all, these studies are mostly quite small. That attests to the difficulty of creating large, substantial cohorts of samples from people with type 1. That remains an ongoing endeavour that needs to be improved, I would say, in the field. So it's important when you make an observation like this to be able to replicate it in another data set. Then you have to actually quantify just how well it improves prediction beyond what we already know. So that requires studies where you calculate things like the area under the ROC curve for prediction. And actually, really only one of the presentations today, one on deep learning from retinal images, seeks to do that.
And which one was that?
So that was the one from Joe Meller, and I should declare an interest here. It's actually from my research group, where we were trying to establish actually just using the retinal photographs that people have routinely taken as part of their retinopathy screening program in Scotland. And what we were doing there was looking at the retinal images and building deep learning algorithms. This is a type of machine learning to see, can you actually extract information about cardiovascular disease from the eye image? Okay.
And of course, people with type 1 diabetes are having regular eye examinations.
Exactly, because it would be great, wouldn't it, if as part of just routine data that you already have, if you could actually also have a little algorithm run on an eye image when it's taken and say, oh, this person looks like a vascular risk of X. So that is preliminary work that Joe Meller undertook, showing that there is information in there to be extracted, but actually there is further work to be done in developing more sophisticated algorithms on larger image banks to extract that information properly and to be clear about the right path to building that into actually generating a prediction score.
So that's fascinating, because it really builds on something that's there already and is not really that expensive to implement.
Yes.
And doesn't require additional staffing, because I think what we're seeing a lot at the moment is anything that requires additional man or woman power is really going to be a problem, because everywhere in the world is suffering from a shortage of healthcare professionals.
Completely. And so there are many steps that go from the preliminary observations of just finding that something circulating, a cytokine or whatever, differs between those with and without vascular disease. There's actually quite a long roadmap from there to a useful predictor, and showing that you have a useful predictor that augments our ability to predict risk and to discriminate between those with more rather than less risk. And I use the word discriminate because that's a statistical term, not a sociological term in this context.
So now I'm going to be really mean. I'm going to do the standard broadcaster's trick of asking you to speculate, which is, in 5 years' time, what do you think is your what's your best bet on the type of predictor that we'll be using?
Well, I think the type of predictor that we will be using will be probably some composite of capturing routine clinical data into a well-calibrated and established equation that uses variables that we already have in electronic healthcare record data sets, like your HbA1c, your blood pressure, your duration of diabetes, your cholesterol level, and so forth, and augmenting that with data from other novel data sources, including from imaging.
And using the machine learning to put it all together.
Exactly.
Fantastic. A really interesting area. Thank you so much for taking the time to come along and see us.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
And you heard
to
it
talk
here
about
first. Thank you very much.